Hello there, sleepy traveler. It's lovely to have you here, in this quiet little corner of the night. You've found your way to a gentle place, where stories drift like clouds, and history hums just beneath the silence. Tonight, we're slipping back to a time long before clocks and cars, before soft beds and quiet evenings. We're going to a world carved in stone and soaked in ritual, a place of order and awe, and sometimes a bit of fear. Why you wouldn't last a day in the Aztec Empire, that's the path we'll walk together tonight, step by step, breath by breath, through bustling markets, towering temples, and the watchful eyes of warriors. It was a place of dazzling colors and strict, sacred rules. Beautiful, but harsh. If you're still awake with me, maybe you'll share where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? It's always such a quiet joy to read your sleepy whispers in the comments. Now, let's leave this world behind for a while and step gently into the ancient heart of Tenochtitlan, where every sunrise belonged to the gods, and every heartbeat had to be earned. Let the stone roads guide you, past painted walls and flower gardens, past children learning to fight, and priests preparing offerings at dawn. This is a land of deep rhythm and deeper meaning, where nothing was casual, and everything was sacred. So close your eyes, if they're ready, and come with me. The empire awaits, and the story is just beginning. In the late 15th century, in the heart of what is now Mexico, a mighty civilization ruled the valley, the Aztec Empire. At its peak, it was one of the most sophisticated societies in the Americas, with floating gardens, towering temples, and a capital city, Tenochtitlan, that stunned even European conquerors. But behind the marvels of stone and water was a world governed by strict discipline and deep religious belief. The Aztecs believed the universe was fragile, that the sun would not rise unless the gods were properly fed. And what did the gods demand? Blood, beating hearts, living offerings. That is why war was sacred, not for conquest, not for territory, but for prisoners' enemies to be sacrificed and given to the gods to keep the world alive. This belief shaped every part of Aztec life, especially the role of men. Every Aztec man was expected to become a warrior, and in this world there was no room for weakness. From the moment a boy was born, his life moved toward one destination, the battlefield. The early years were not soft or sheltered. Boys were raised with strict discipline. If a child was lazy, he might be pricked with cactus thorns. If he disobeyed or complained, he could be forced to inhale smoke from burning chili peppers. A sharp, painful reminder of obedience. These were not punishments of cruelty. They were the first lessons in strength. At the age of 7, every boy entered formal training. If he was from a noble family, he might go to the Comicac, where he would study religion, leadership, and military strategy. Commoners went to the Telpacelli, where the focus was purely on physical endurance, obedience, and preparation for battle. But neither school was easy. Boys carried heavy loads of firewood, marched barefoot over thorns, fasted, and slept on cold stone floors. They were taught to suffer in silence, to accept pain without protest, and to serve the needs of the empire above their own. Weapons training was introduced early: obsidian-bladed clubs, spears, shields, and throwing darts. But more important than fighting was restraint, the ability to injure without killing, to trap and capture, to bring enemies back alive. That was the Aztec definition of victory: to capture a prisoner, was to serve the gods and to rise in rank. To kill unnecessarily was to waste a sacred offering. Every lesson, every hardship, every ritual was part of a lifelong molding process designed to make sure that by the time a boy reached manhood, he was not just strong but useful, not just brave but controlled, not just skilled but loyal. But still, a quiet question remained in many young hearts. What if I can't do it? What if I fail to capture an enemy? What happens to the boys who break under the weight of all this pressure, but are too afraid to say so? You've survived the training, the thorns, the cold nights, the silence, the fasting. Your body is hard now, your thoughts sharp, your instincts quick. You know how to obey, how to endure, how to fight. But none of that makes you a warrior. Yet, becoming a true warrior means proving yourself in battle, and not by killing, by capturing. The Aztec Empire did not wage war for land or gold. Wars were often arranged, ritualized, designed to collect prisoners. These were known as flower wars, and their purpose was clear: gather live captives for sacrifice. The gods demanded blood, but they preferred it from those taken honorably in combat. You march into your first campaign, standing beside veterans dressed in brilliant feathers and jaguar skins. You wear plain cloth. You are young, nervous, but determined. The enemy charges. You fight, careful not to kill. You trip a man, strike to stun, bind his arms. It takes all your strength to drag him through the chaos. You don't feel pride yet, only exhaustion and disbelief. But when you return to the city with a captive behind you, everything changes. You're invited to eat at the temple. You're given a colored cloak. Your father meets your eyes with respect. Your name is whispered with new weight. Still, one capture is only the beginning. If you want to advance, to marry, to own land, to rise in rank, you must do it again and again, for captures bring you honor. They open the door to the elite warrior societies, the eagle warriors and the jaguar warriors. These are not just fighters, they are nobles in spirit, guardians of the state, examples to all. But the expectations grow heavier with every step up the ladder. Now you must bleed for the gods. Small cuts along your ears, your tongue, your arms, giving your own body as an offering. You must fast before festivals, stand for hours in the sun during rituals, remain silent when ordered, and kneel when called. You cannot show pain, you cannot show doubt. You must never show fear. The higher you climb, the more people watch you, the more they expect. One mistake, one sign of weakness, and your honor can begin to unravel. And so, many warriors carry a second kind of burden, the pressure to never fall, even when no one sees. Because in a world where strength is sacred, the cost of weakness is not punishment, it is shame. Yet not every man succeeds. Some never return with a captive, some break under the rituals, some drift into silence, their names forgotten. You are told not to speak of them, and yet you remember them. You wonder, what became of the boys who began with you, the ones who trained just as hard, but never earned the cloak, the ones who now sweep the temple floors or vanish into the crowd. You tell yourself you're different, you must be, you made it. But deep inside, you know, the real battle was never the enemy in front of you. It was the quiet fight inside you, the one against doubt, exhaustion, and fear. And one day, a greater enemy may arrive, one you weren't trained for. Will all of this be enough? You've earned your place. You've captured enemies, bled for your gods, risen through the ranks. You wear the jaguar skin or eagle feathers with pride. People step aside when you walk through the marketplace. Children point at you. In awe, your family name is spoken with honor. And yet, something is changing. In the year 1519, strangers arrive on the distant coast, pale-skinned, metal-clad, riding animals no one has ever seen, horses. They carry weapons that roar like thunder, cutting through shields and bodies alike. They are few in number, but they bring something deadlier than blades: disease, confusion, and alliance with your enemies. You are a warrior. You prepare like always. You sharpen your obsidian blade, paint your face, pray to Huitzilopochtli. You believe this is just another battle. You've fought many before. You have the gods on your side. You are Aztec, but the rules of war are different. Now these invaders don't fight for honor. They don't take prisoners. They don't follow the rituals of the Flower War. They fight to conquer, to destroy, to erase. They don't respect the gods. They burn the temples. They melt the gold. They laugh at ceremony. You face them in open combat. You fight with the same discipline you've trained for since boyhood. But something is wrong. Their armor is too strong. Their horses are too fast. Their weapons too unfamiliar. You see your fellow warriors fall, not from wounds, but from illness. Smallpox spreads like fire. Families die without ever drawing a sword. Tenochtitlan, the mighty city of canals and stone, begins to crumble. The markets are empty. The temples desecrated. The gods are silent. You still fight, because that's what you were raised to do. But deep down, a terrible thought begins to grow. What if strength alone isn't enough? What if all your years of discipline, all your captured enemies, all the blood you gave to the gods, can't stop this? Still, you hold the line, because even if your empire falls, even if your name is forgotten, you know one thing: you did not break. You stood your ground. You fought with honor. You followed the code. You fulfilled your duty. You never showed fear, never gave up, never knelt in the eyes of the world. You may be defeated, but in the eyes of your ancestors, and in the rhythm of your heartbeat, you remained exactly what they trained you to be: a warrior. And as you fall from a sword, a gun, or a sickness, you remember the prophecy that those who die in battle rise with the sun, soaring across the sky for 4 sacred years before returning to earth as flowers or birds. You close your eyes. Perhaps the gods are still watching. Perhaps they still remember you. In the great Aztec Empire, not everyone wore feathers and held spears. Behind the glory of warriors and priests stood millions of ordinary people: farmers, porters, artisans, servants. And for them, life was not about glory. It was about survival. If you were born an Aztec commoner, a machahuli, your path was already set. You would rise early, work all day, obey the rules, and keep your place. There was no luxury, no softness, and very little rest. You were not allowed to be lazy, not even for a moment. Each morning began long before the sun. Your family home was a small, one-room hut made of mud and reeds. The roof was low. The floor was earth. In that darkness, the air still heavy from sleep, your mother stirred the coals. You could hear the grind of stone against stone as she began to prepare the corn, the heart of every meal you didn't get to sleep in. In fact, if your parents caught you lying in bed after dawn, they might sprinkle cold water on your face. If you were still lazy, they'd rub your arms with chili peppers, a fiery sting to remind you never to waste time. Your tasks began at once. If you were a boy, you fetched water from the canal, gathered firewood, or weeded the milpa, the field, where maize, beans, and squash grew. If you were a girl, you learned to grind corn, make tortillas, carry food, sweep the floors, and care for younger siblings. Everything had a purpose. Every movement was part of a rhythm that never stopped. There was no free time, no privacy, no rest until nightfall, and even then, only if you had done your share. The Aztec calendar was filled with rituals and festivals, but those were not holidays in the modern sense. They were sacred obligations. Sometimes you would fast for days, other times you would stay up all night watching ceremonies by torchlight. It was beautiful, yes, but exhausting. And even on those days, the corn still needed grinding. The fields still needed tending. Children were taught from the start. Idleness was sin by age 7. You were already contributing to the household. And if you slacked, punishment came swiftly. A disobedient child might be forced to inhale chili, smoke a sharp, painful method believed to burn laziness out of the soul. And yet, for all the hardship, there was pride in duty. You were part of something vast, a city, a system, a cycle of life and death. You knew your place. You accepted it. You worked not just for food, but to feed the gods. Every tortilla you helped shape was a tiny act of worship. Still, as the sun rose higher and sweat gathered on your brow, a quiet question might stir. Is this what life will always be? Waking in the dark, working until dusk, without ever asking why. By the time the sun had fully risen over Tenochtitlan or the surrounding valleys, your muscles were already aching. You'd been working for hours, hauling water, gathering wood, or preparing food, and the day had only just begun. You didn't own land. Most Aztec commoners worked Calpulli land, communal plots that were shared by neighborhood groups. You owed part of your harvest to the state and to the temple. What was left, you kept for your family. Sometimes that wasn't much, and if the weather was poor or the tribute heavy, your meals shrank. But the work never did. Maize was your lifeblood. So was obsidian, the volcanic glass used for tools and weapons. So was cotton cloth, which could serve as currency, tax, and tribute. If your household specialized in weaving or pottery, that was your daily life, crafting piece after piece, hour after hour, under the eye of family elders who ensured no one fell behind. The empire needed your labor. Without commoners, there were no warriors, no ceremonies, no kings. But the empire rarely thanked you for it. Instead, it demanded more cloth, more food, more service. The state could call on you at any time to become a porter, carrying goods across rough terrain for days at a time. You were the engine that kept the empire running, and engines aren't meant to rest. Marriage didn't slow things down either. If anything, it added to your workload. A wife was expected to spin, weave, cook, and care for children. A husband worked the fields, made offerings, built the house, and trained the sons. Even rest was structured. There was a proper way to sleep, to speak, to bathe, to behave. There were rituals for every act and rules for every ritual, and there were eyes everywhere. Aztec society prized discipline. Laziness was not just frowned upon, it was punishable. Community elders and local officials, known as Kalpixk, oversaw tribute and behavior. If you fell behind on your duties or disrespected tradition, your punishment could be public. Beatings were common. So was humiliation. In extreme cases, you could be enslaved, not for life, but long enough to feel the weight of your mistake. Children grew up watching all of this. And so, By the time they reached adolescence, they rarely questioned it. You didn't complain. You didn't resist. You simply worked. Yet, in rare quiet moments, perhaps when watching the ripples in a canal, or listening to the wind in the maze, some might wonder, did the gods really demand this much from the common people, or had the empire learned to speak in the god's name for its own survival? As night approaches, the light fades from the maize fields and canals. You return home, not to rest, but to continue working in smaller ways. There are tortillas to shape, clothes to mend, tools to sharpen. Your children are still young, but they help where they can. They've seen what happens to those who don't. You might eat only twice a day. The evening meal is simple: maize, gruel, beans, maybe squash. If it's a festival, or if your tribute was accepted with favor, you may have chili sauce, or even a bit of tamale. Meat is rare. Chocolate, rarer still. Those are luxuries for nobles and warriors. You eat to survive, not to indulge. The fire burns low as you clean your tools and whisper small prayers to the household gods. Not grand temples, just small clay idols tucked near the hearth. You ask for health, rain, safety from bad omens. You don't ask for rest. That would be foolish. Sleep comes early, not from peace, but from exhaustion. On a mat of woven reeds, you lie down next to your family. The air is thick with smoke and earth. Your muscles twitch with the ache of work. But you sleep quickly. You have to. The next day will be exactly the same. There are no weekends. No holidays without obligation. Even during grand festivals, you are working, cooking, cleaning, preparing offerings, staying up through the night to witness sacred dances that are not meant for your entertainment, but your submission. If you live long enough, your role does not change. Age may slow your steps, but not your duties. The only hope for ease is through your children. If your sons become warriors and return with captives, the family may gain a higher status. If your daughters marry well or serve in the temples, you may earn quiet recognition. But these are small hopes. You were not born to climb. You were born to carry. Still, even in this life of hardship, there is rhythm. The sunrise always returns. The maize always grows. The gods are always fed. You are a thread in the great weaving of the empire. Necessary, replaceable, invisible. Some might say it is a harsh life, and it is, but it is also filled with meaning. You belong, you contribute, you endure, and in the Aztec world, to endure was the greatest offering of all. But still, as you drift into sleep once again, your hands cracked, your back bent, one final thought may remain. Was this life shaped by divine order, or by men who learned how to shape others? Today, you dress based on mood, weather, or perhaps a sense of style. But for much of human history, what you wore wasn't just a personal choice, it was a legal matter. In medieval and early modern societies across Europe, Asia, and even parts of the Islamic world, clothing was tightly regulated through sumptuary laws, a fancy name for rules that told you what not to wear. These laws weren't about decency or modesty, they were about status. You could not simply wear what you liked. If your clothes made you look wealthier or nobler than you truly were, you could be punished, fined, stripped, or even jailed. Why? Because appearance was power, and power belonged to the elite. In 14th century England, a farm labourer might work from dawn till dusk, yet he was legally forbidden from wearing silk, velvet, or even certain colours like purple or deep crimson. Those shades were reserved for nobles. not because of their beauty, but because of what they symbolized: royal blood, divine favor, and control. In Florence, Italy, during the Renaissance, laws detailed exactly how wide a woman's sleeves could be and how much lace she was allowed to show. Tailors had to keep copies of the regulations in their shops. A mistake wasn't just bad business, it could get you arrested. In Ming Dynasty China, dragon embroidery, a symbol of the emperor, was off limits to everyone else. Even wealthy merchants, who had more money than most nobles, were restricted to duller fabrics and simpler robes. Their riches could build cities, but not dress like royalty. And in Japan's Edo period, even hairstyles were regulated. Certain top knots were permitted only for samurai. If a commoner wore one, it was a silent act of rebellion. The logic behind these rules was simple, yet strict. Clothing was a social code, and violating that code was like lying about your rank. But there was more to it than pride. Sumptuary laws were also about control. They made sure the lines between classes didn't blur. They kept peasants in their place, merchants humbled, and elites visibly above all others. In a world without modern IDs or tax records, clothing was how society recognized who you were. These laws were enforced by local officials, guild inspectors, or sometimes even religious authorities. In some regions, tailors were legally required to snitch on their customers if they requested forbidden garments. In others, neighbors were encouraged to report violations, making fashion not just personal, but political. Still, people found ways around the rules. They layered, they stitched in secret, they paid bribes, or wore garments at home that they couldn't show in public. In some regions, enforcement was relaxed, especially if the economy needed the textile trade to flourish. But the idea remained: your outfit wasn't truly yours. As you lie back and imagine living in such a world, you might wonder, what would your clothes say about you? If the law had the final word, the idea that clothing could disrupt society might seem strange today. But in many historical cultures, it was taken very seriously. A tunic too fine, a hat too wide, or a fabric too rare could cause unease, even outrage. Why? Because clothing didn't just reflect wealth. It challenged the very order of the world. In 16th century England, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, Parliament passed dozens of sumptuary laws, detailing exactly what each class could wear. The rules were so precise that they became a kind of fashion scripture. Knights could wear satin doublets, but not velvet. Barons could wear velvet trimmed with ermine, but silk or gold embroidery, reserved only for royalty or nobles of the highest rank. The Queen herself was a firm believer in these laws. To her, allowing commoners to dress richly threatened the stability of the kingdom. If anyone could appear noble, how would true nobles be recognized? The visual order mattered as much as the legal one. Meanwhile, in Mughal India, the emperor's court was a theatre of visual splendor. Jeweled turbans, robes of fine muslin and silk, shoes embroidered with gold. But all of this was coded. An official's rank could be read in the number of pearls on his sash, or the weight of the embroidery on his cuffs. You couldn't just dress up and pretend. Even small details mattered. In medieval France, buttons were regulated, not for function, but for ornament. A merchant could wear them in bone or wood. A noble might wear them in gold or adorned with enamel. These details were noticed. They were part of a silent language. But what happened when money entered the equation? That's when things got tricky. In many regions, especially cities in Italy, Germany, and the Islamic world. A new class of people was rising, merchants and artisans. They had no noble blood, but they had coins, sometimes more than the aristocrats. They could afford fine silks, expensive dyes, fur-lined cloaks, and they wanted to wear them. It became a quiet rebellion, not with swords, but with sleeves, in Venice. The wives of wealthy merchants would flaunt luxurious dresses. During public processions, despite repeated warnings from city magistrates, in Ottoman cities, spice dealers dressed like court officials. In Ming China, wealthy farmers secretly embroidered imperial symbols into their household robes, only to wear them behind closed doors. Authorities struggled to keep up. Sometimes the laws were rewritten to adjust for inflation. Other times, new taxes were introduced, allowing the rich to buy permission to wear what they wanted. This quietly turned privilege into a commodity. The line between nobility and wealth began to blur. Still, the deeper issue remained. If clothing became untied from rank, what would happen to the foundations of power? In every society that enforced sumptuary laws, that fear lingered. The fear that status could be worn, even when it wasn't earned. That authority could be mimicked. That identity, once so easy to read by sight, might become invisible. And so, behind every stitched hem and forbidden color, one question pulsed quietly beneath the fabric. If anyone can look noble, then what does nobility really mean? By the 18th century, many sumptuary laws were beginning to fade. The rise of urban economies, merchant wealth, and printed fashion plates began to challenge the old world order. A tailor's shop in Paris or Istanbul could now make a commoner look like a prince, if the customer could pay. And more they could. The line between appearance and status was beginning to fracture. In France, just decades before the Revolution, noble fashion became almost theatrical. Massive powdered wigs, layers of silk and lace, feathered hats, jewel-covered shoes. But while the court of Versailles obsessed over appearance, the streets of Paris told a different story, one of rising merchants, angry workers, and a growing hunger for equality. When the French Revolution exploded, clothing became a symbol once again, not of division, but rebellion. The aristocracy's flamboyant outfits were replaced by simple garments. The sans revolutionaries proudly wore trousers instead of the breeches of noblemen. Simplicity was now a statement of power. To dress plainly was to reject the hierarchy. And once the king himself lost his crown and his head, the idea that clothing should reflect divine rank began to vanish. Elsewhere, the same shift was underway. In England, industrialization brought cheap fabrics to the masses. In India, the spinning wheel became a tool of resistance against British textile imports. In America, the suit, simple, dark, uniform, emerged as a symbol of equality and seriousness, meant to erase class distinctions in business and politics. But, even as legal restrictions disappeared, unwritten rules remained. Clothing still signaled who you were, or who you wanted to be. A black dress might signal mourning. A stiff collar might signal discipline. A white robe might suggest spiritual purity. A designer logo might whisper wealth. A uniform could still give authority, even without royal permission. And today, in countless places around the world, rules about dress remain, though rarely called laws. In schools, in workplaces, in courts and mosques and temples, you are often told how to appear. What is respectful, what is proper, what is too much. These are echoes of those old codes, softened, but still present, because the truth is, Clothing has never been just cloth. It has always been language, a silent language of status, belief, belonging, or rebellion. So, as you fold your clothes for tomorrow, or choose what to wear for a quiet day, consider this: you have freedoms that your ancestors never imagined. No one can fine you for wearing silk. No one can arrest you for dressing above your class. No neighbor will report your embroidered jacket. And if they do, it won't be the law that judges you. But still, we dress for the eyes of others. We still send messages without words. And we still wonder if clothing no longer reflects law or class. Then what does it reveal now, and to whom? In the mighty Aztec Empire, food was everywhere, yet pleasure was rare. Markets overflowed with goods: tomatoes, beans, maize, chiles, avocados, and even chocolate. Vendors sold steaming tamales, wrapped in corn husks, frothy drinks made from fermented sap, and roasted insects seasoned with salt and lime. But don't be fooled. These delicacies weren't for everyone. Most people didn't eat to enjoy, they ate to survive. If you were a commoner, and most people were, your daily diet was plain, repetitive, and limited. The backbone of your meals was maize or corn. Ground, boiled, pounded, steamed, it came in many forms, but tasted largely the same. You had atole, a thin corn drink, for breakfast, tortillas with beans for lunch, and at night, more tortillas. Maybe with squash or chiles, if you were lucky. You didn't ask what you were eating. You asked how much was left. Protein came rarely. Meat, turkey, rabbit, or duck was for the wealthy or for festivals. Occasionally, you might catch frogs or grasshoppers. Fish was available in lake regions, but not in abundance. More often, your source of protein came from insects, larvae, or amaranth, a seed that was pounded into paste. The nobles and priests lived differently. They dined on tamales stuffed with mushrooms or fish, stews flavored with herbs and salt, and sauces rich in roasted chiles and ground pumpkin seeds. They drank cacao, a bitter, foamy chocolate drink, flavored with vanilla or spice, but not sweetened. Sugar didn't exist in the empire. That would come centuries later. You, on the other hand, ate the same thing every day. And not because you lacked creativity, but because you lacked choice. Food was a resource managed by the state. Tribute grain, state-run granaries, and crop rotation meant that food was stored and distributed carefully. But in drought years, or when war disrupted trade routes, shortages struck quickly. When famine came, people ground acorns into flour or ate the inner bark of trees. Hunger, for many, was a constant threat, just out of sight, but never far. Yet, even so, meals were sacred. The act of eating wasn't casual. You washed your hands. You sat in order. Children were taught never to eat before their elders. Food was offered to the hearth gods, the spirits of maize, and the memory of the dead. Wasting food was not just rude, it was a sin. Still, as you chewed your dry tortilla and sipped your third bowl of atole that week, a quiet thought might flicker. Is this truly the reward for all our work? To labor from dawn to dusk, only to eat the same corn again tomorrow. To the Aztecs, food wasn't just nourishment, it was order. A person's meal reflected their status, their role in society, and even their relationship with the gods. But while noble banquets and sacred offerings capture our imagination today, the truth for most people was simpler and far harsher. You were what you ate, and most people ate very little. If you were a warrior, your rations were slightly better. but only while on campaign. Corn cakes wrapped in leaves, dried beans, salted insects, or ground chia seeds might be carried for energy. But even warriors, once home, returned to the basic diet of the people. Victory in battle brought glory, not groceries. Food was also tied to law. In many parts of the empire, strict rules governed what you could and couldn't eat. Turkeys and cacao were reserved for the upper classes. If a commoner was caught eating foods meant for nobles or priests, the punishment could be severe, even death in extreme cases. These laws ensured that luxury remained symbolic, visible only in the hands of those who deserved it. Feasting was reserved for ceremonies, weddings, harvest festivals, temple rituals. But even then, the hierarchy remained. A noble might feast on several courses of tamales, sauces, fish, and roasted meat. A commoner, likely a small bowl of stew, some fresh tortillas, and fermented maize drink known as pulque, made from the sap of the maguey plant, was one of the few indulgences available to the average Aztec. But even this came with rules. Drunkenness was forbidden except in old age or during ceremonies. A young man caught intoxicated could be publicly humiliated or worse. The Aztecs believed that loss of control invited the displeasure of the gods. For children, the diet was even stricter. Until around age 10, they were often fed maize, gruel, and vegetables, plain, soft, and repetitive. This wasn't due to poverty alone. The Aztecs believed children needed discipline in every form, even in taste. Sweetness and spice were for adults. Until then, food was a lesson in endurance. Still, food had a spiritual weight. The Aztecs believed that maize was a sacred gift. According to their creation myths, humanity itself was formed from maize dough, the same substance that fed their bodies. To eat corn was to renew a covenant with the gods. Every tortilla folded, every pot stirred, was a quiet ritual of gratitude. Even death didn't end the relationship with food. The dead were buried with tamales or maize to help them on their journey through the underworld. On special days, families laid out offerings of food on altars, not for the living, but for the ancestors, who might return to visit in spirit. Food, then, was survival, yes, but also identity. It reminded you who you were, and who you were not. Yet, as you sat down beside your family for another simple meal, the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow, a quiet thought might rise. If maize made us, why does it leave so many of us still hungry? The Aztec world was built on maize, not just as food, but as philosophy. It was life, law, labor, and lineage, ground together into tortillas and swallowed day after day. But like all empires, even this carefully balanced world was not immune to collapse. And when it began to fall, it was hunger that arrived first. In the early 1500s, as Spanish ships neared the coast and whispers of strange men and animals reached the capital, the daily rhythms of Aztec life were already under stress. Years of tribute demands, droughts, and overworked farmlands had pushed many commoners to the edge of subsistence. Granaries emptied faster, prices rose, and the bare-bones diet became even barer. When Hernan Cortes and his forces finally entered the Valley of Mexico, the disruption was swift and brutal. Trade routes collapsed, fields were burned, farmers conscripted as porters or warriors left their crops untended, and as disease spread faster than swords, entire villages starved, not from lack of effort, but from a system suddenly shattered. Suddenly, the sacred maize wasn't enough. people began eating what they once considered unthinkable: grass, bark, roots, lizards. During the long siege of Tenochtitlan in Iwo survivors later recalled boiling leather for soup and scraping moss from stones to stay alive. It was not survival guided by tradition, it was desperation, and in that desperation, something ancient broke. For centuries, the Aztec people had endured strict diets, harsh laws, and food rituals, not because they were cruel, but because they made sense within their world. To obey was to maintain order. To eat simply was to preserve balance. But when that world began to vanish, temple by temple, crop by crop, the meaning behind those sacrifices faded too. After the conquest, new foods entered the land: wheat, pigs, cattle, sugar. Spanish colonists built ranches where china once floated, maize remained, but now it was mixed with lard, turned into foods flavored by foreign hands. Diets changed, so did faith. The gods who once demanded blood and maize were replaced by new saints, new prayers, new holidays. Yet traces of the old ways never disappeared completely to this day. In villages across Mexico, people still grind. Corn on stone, still wrap tamales in husks, still greet the day with a tole. The recipes may have evolved, but the rhythm remains. Because in every meal of maize, there is a memory, not just of nourishment, but of identity. A reminder that even when life was harsh, and food was scarce, and flavor was a luxury, the act of eating still meant something. Not indulgence, not pleasure, but connection to land, to gods, to each other. So the next time you sit before a plate of food, rich or simple, spiced or plain, consider this: to eat without fear is a gift, to eat with joy a blessing, but to eat even when joy is gone, that too is survival. And maybe, before we drift any deeper into this quiet world of the past, let's take a small, gentle pause together, just for a moment. Let's stretch our thoughts across the world, to the soft hush of faraway nights. Perhaps someone is listening from a candlelit room in Brazil, where the warm air hums gently outside the window, and the soft flicker of shadows plays on the old wooden floor. Or maybe, far to the north, a quiet soul is resting beneath thick wool blankets in Finland, where the air is cool and clean, and the last light of the midnight sun fades slowly behind the pines. And perhaps, even farther still, someone in Mauritania lies under a vast, starlit sky, the desert wind brushing over sand like a whisper, their phone glowing softly beneath a woven canopy. Wherever you are, thank you for being here. Thank you for making space in your night to join this peaceful journey, if you'd like. You can softly tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Only if your eyes are still open. Only if sleep hasn't already begun its gentle pull. Now, let's return to the story, and let the past cradle us once again, in its quiet, ancient arms. In the Aztec Empire, the marketplace wasn't just a place to buy and sell. It was a tightly controlled space where law, order, and surveillance ruled just as strongly as trade and conversation. Picture yourself stepping into Tlatelolco, the grand marketplace of Tenochtitlan, the beating economic heart of the empire. It was a sprawling, organized grid of stalls and walkways, with goods brought from every corner of Mesoamerica. Each day, it welcomed tens of thousands of buyers, sellers, and traders. You could find cacao beans, obsidian blades, feathered cloaks, live turkeys, tobacco, salt, and even slaves. But this was no place for casual haggling. The Aztecs treated their market with the same seriousness as they did their temples. Order was sacred. Disruption was dangerous. There were strict rules and brutal consequences for anyone who violated the order of trade. Trade in the Aztec world operated largely on a barter system, with cacao beans and cotton cloaks sometimes serving as informal currency, but values were standardized. 100 cacao beans might buy a turkey hen. A few cotton mantles could earn you a small obsidian knife, and woe unto the trader who tried to cheat. Inspectors, known as market judges or tianquit pan, Tlaquatl, roamed constantly, listening, watching, and intervening when needed. They were not simply moderators. They had the authority to punish. If someone was caught selling spoiled food, they could be publicly shamed. A dishonest wait might result in confiscation of goods, or worse. Repeat offenders could be tied to a post and beaten before the crowd, a lesson to others in the value of fairness. Market judges also enforced zoning rules. Specific areas were reserved for different goods. Fruits in one quadrant, textiles in another, tools elsewhere. A vendor setting up in the wrong place, even by accident, could be ordered to shut down or relocate. There were inspectors of speech, 2 officials who listened for lies, false claims, or improper conduct. Even the gods watched. Merchants often prayed before setting up their stores. Offerings were left to Yaxcatectli, the god of commerce. Trade was not a free-for-all. It was a moral and spiritual act, bound to duty and the cosmic balance. Profit was accepted, but not if it came through deceit. And then there were the taxes. Goods brought from outside regions, especially conquered provinces, were taxed before being allowed to enter. Tax collectors were stationed along roads and canals, checking shipments for undeclared goods. Traders unable to pay were turned back or fined. Some might even be detained for tax evasion, a serious offense in a society where tribute upheld the emperor's power. So imagine yourself, a newcomer, trying to sell baskets of maize from a distant village. You're assigned a stall. Your goods are counted, weighed, and sniffed. A judge watches your interaction with the first buyer. Your language, your manners, your measurements, all under inspection. You're not just selling, you're being tested, because in the Aztec marketplace, commerce was law, and mercy had little place beside the weighing stones. And as the crowd swells and drums echo in the distance, you ask yourself, in a system where every trade is monitored, what happens to those who can't afford to be perfect? Trade was the lifeblood of the Aztec Empire, but merchants were not free agents. They were watched, regulated, and ultimately used to maintain the stability of the empire. The professional merchant class, known as the Pochteca, held a unique place in Aztec society. On the surface, they seemed privileged. They traveled far, across Mesoamerica, negotiated with foreign leaders, and often grew rich from their work. But they also lived under intense scrutiny. Their journeys were allowed only with permission, and many acted as informants for the state, spying on other cities, gathering tribute data, and reporting on unrest. The empire relied on this flow of information as much as on the flow of goods. Merchants were subject to state expectations, especially when it came to tribute. Provinces that were conquered didn't just owe loyalty, they owed physical goods: maize, cacao, cloth, rubber, feathers, salt. The market was where these tributes were often collected, distributed, or taxed. Failing to meet tribute quotas wasn't just embarrassing, it could bring swift military retaliation. And in the center of this system were the inspectors, ever present, ever alert. Some inspectors kept records on paper made from bark, noting quantities sold and prices agreed upon. Others walked silently among the stalls, observing how people behaved, particularly toward outsiders and nobles. If a trader showed disrespect, raised his voice, or misled a buyer, he could be removed instantly. Justice was swift. Public punishment wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Markets also served a deeper purpose. They reinforced social order. People weren't just selling corn and fish. They were selling them from their assigned place, based on their rank, origin, and status. Nobles sold high-end goods like jade, obsidian, or fine feathers. Commoners dealt in food, salt, or tools. Slaves were bought and sold, too, not hidden away, but placed in designated areas, shackled, awaiting buyers, and, like everything else, slave sales were monitored. The buyer was required to publicly announce their intent. The seller had to declare how the slave had been obtained. There were rules for age, condition, and even behavior. If a slave was too rebellious or had tried to escape before, the price dropped. The state did not tolerate deception, not in the sale of tools, nor in the sale of human beings. Even weights and measures were standardized. Stones and wooden sticks were used as official units of weight, and anyone caught using false scales faced public shame or physical punishment. Cheating a customer, even by a little, wasn't seen as clever. It was a spiritual imbalance, a threat to the harmony of the market, and thus of the world in Aztec cosmology. Balance was everything, and that included the balance of trade. So you can imagine, as a seller in Tlatelolco, what it felt like to stand behind your goods. Every hand movement watched, every price whispered, every smile calculated. You might wonder if the buyer in front of you is just another customer or an inspector in disguise. Because here, under the stone towers and sacred drums, the marketplace wasn't just an economic space, it was a stage, and you were being judged. And as the sun beat down on the open square and the incense curled skyward, a question lingers. If every transaction was a test, how long could you really last under such constant judgment? In the Aztec world, the marketplace was not just a site of commerce, it was a mirror of the empire itself. Every transaction reflected the values, fears, and ambitions of a society, held together by order, ritual, and watchful eyes. But what happened when that world began to collapse? When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, they were stunned by the scale and discipline of Tlatelolco's market. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortes' expedition, wrote with awe of how the market was twice as large as the city of San, and how there were judges who sat in the marketplace and kept order. The Spaniards recognized the market's power, and they sought to take control of it quickly. After the fall of Tenochtitlan in Iwal-Ayi, the Spanish dismantled the imperial economy. Tribute networks collapsed. Market regulations faded. The Pochteka lost their influence, and many local inspectors vanished. Spanish currency replaced cacao beans. Christian holidays overtook market cycles. A system built on bartering, divine observation, and cultural codes was replaced by European-style commerce and colonial taxation. And yet, not everything disappeared. For generations after the conquest, many indigenous people continued to gather. In open-air markets, they traded familiar goods. They observed local rules. In remote villages, some communities still used cacao as currency. Though weakened, the idea of the structured market lived on, not by law, but by memory. But something else lingered too. The sense of surveillance. Colonial authorities took inspiration from the Aztecs, appointing their own inspectors to prevent fraud and collect taxes. In many ways, the Spanish merely rebranded the system, layering new beliefs atop old expectations. The punishments changed, the gods changed, but the pressure to conform remained. And so, the marketplace evolved. It became a place where worlds collided, old and new, native and foreign, memory and power. Traders now had to speak both Nahuatl and Spanish. They had to obey both village elders and colonial magistrates. They still feared being watched, but no longer by priests of commerce. Now it was by bureaucrats with ledgers and foreign tongues. The rhythm of trade continued, but the soul of the market had shifted. And yet, the legacy of that discipline, of weighing truth on the same scale as maize, never entirely faded. Even today, in the bustling Tianguis street markets of modern Mexico, echoes of the past can be heard. The shouted prices, the careful arrangements, the quiet watchfulness. There is still pride in presenting clean goods, respect for space, and deep memory in the practice of haggling. Some vendors still pray before they open their stalls. Not to Yucatec, perhaps, but to something just as sacred. The hope of fairness, and the fear of failure. Because whether under the Aztec sun or neon lights, the rules of the marketplace remain unforgiving. So, as you stand there, centuries later, watching the crowd pass by, you may ask, was it ever just about selling things? Or was the Aztec marketplace really about learning how to survive in a world that never stopped watching you? You're standing atop the Templo Mayor, the great twin pyramid in the center of Tenochtitlan. The stone beneath your bare feet is warm from the sun and stained unmistakably with old blood. Around you the city pulses with life, canals glimmering, marketplaces humming, children laughing somewhere below. But here, high above the streets, it is quiet. The priest raises his arms. The drumbeat quickens. You do not look away. Because in the Aztec world, to witness sacrifice is not horror, it is honor. Blood was not merely symbolic in Aztec religion, it was essential. The sun moved across the sky only because the gods had once sacrificed themselves to make it so. Human beings owed them a debt, and the only proper payment was life itself. Not just prayers, not just offerings of corn or feathers, but blood, fresh, flowing, sacred. This belief shaped everything, each day. The Aztecs marked the passage of time, not by months or years, but by ritual cycles, many of which involved sacrifice. There were different gods for rain, war, maize, fertility, and each had their appointed days and expectations. Sacrifice wasn't random. It was calendar-bound, precise, and carried out with deep ceremony. The people didn't consider it cruelty. They considered it duty. And the victims, they were often captured warriors, taken alive in battle, and kept for ceremonial purposes. To be sacrificed was not necessarily viewed as punishment. In fact, to die atop the pyramid, heart in hand, of the priest was to become part of the sacred story. Some victims even believed that their death would transform them, sending their souls to join the sun, or to follow the gods through the sky. Still, it was a spectacle. Tens of thousands could gather to watch. Drums echoed, dancers swirled, incense rose like smoke from the underworld. And at the center of it all, the offering, stripped, painted, stretched across the stone slab, a flint blade, a priest's practiced hand, a single motion, a crimson burst, the heart, still beating, raised to the heavens. It is not the gore that mattered, it was what it meant. Each drop was renewal. Each sacrifice kept the balance intact. Without it, the world could unravel. The sun might refuse to rise. Crops might fail. Rain might vanish. And so the people stood and watched, not with pleasure, not with shame, but with reverence. To look away was to break the connection. Children were brought to watch, so they might learn early the seriousness of the world. Elders murmured prayers. Some wept, others were silent, but all stayed, all looked, because this was not death. This was continuation. And yet, standing there, breathing the incense, hearing the cries, watching the blood run down the sacred steps, you might feel something stir inside. A question you're not supposed to ask. If the gods demand so much to keep the world alive, how fragile must that world truly be? From a modern distance, it's easy to see Aztec sacrifice as brutal. But for the people living within that world, it was not an act of cruelty. It was part of a sacred cycle of giving and receiving. Life came from the gods. Life must be returned, and not just any blood would do. The gods had their preferences. The sun god, Huitzilopochtli, for instance, required the hearts of warriors to ensure the dawn. Without his nourishment, the sun might stall in the sky or never rise again. Tlaloc, the rain god, favored the tears of children. Yes, actual tears. On certain festivals, children were sacrificed, their crying believed to call forth rain. It is a fact difficult to grasp today, but within the Aztec worldview, it made complete sense to please the gods. Sincerity mattered. The offering had to be willing, or at least respectful. That's why victims were bathed, dressed, honored, and sometimes given feasts before their final day. A captured warrior, if brave in his final moments, could earn eternal glory. In some cases, his captor would mourn him as a worthy opponent, a soul now transformed into a celestial companion. But sacrifice wasn't just for prisoners or outsiders. Ordinary citizens, too, participated in the blood economy, though in smaller ways. Self-bloodletting was a common form of devotion. Nobles pierced their earlobes, lips, or even tongues, collecting their blood on paper and burning it in offering. Peasants might pierce their skin with cactus thorns during festivals. Even rulers, including emperors, drew their own blood in public. Ceremonies to demonstrate humility before the gods. Blood was a currency, but also a bridge, a living thread that connected human beings to divine will. Temples became the center of this spiritual economy. The most important, the Templo Mayor, loomed over Tenochtitlan like a stairway to the heavens, or to the gods' hunger. Its twin shrines honored Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc side by side. On major festival days, hundreds of sacrifices might be made in a single ceremony. According to some chroniclers, the steps ran red with blood, a river of renewal flowing down to the city below. Still, not everyone was comfortable. Even among the Aztecs, some feared that the appetite for sacrifice had grown too great. Some priests argued that ritual bloodshed was losing its meaning, becoming more political than spiritual. There were rumors that certain festivals were extended for spectacle, that captives were paraded not as holy offerings, but as trophies, that blood was being spent too freely, not to honor the gods, but to intimidate rivals. Others, particularly in conquered regions, saw Aztec rituals not as divine, but as terrifying. The expanding empire demanded tribute not just in maize or cloth, but in human lives. Subject peoples were forced to give captives, fueling the endless cycle. For them, the Aztec pyramids were not sacred sites, but harvest grounds for blood, and still, the drums continued, the incense rose. The gods were fed, but beneath that rhythm, another question began to grow. Can devotion survive when fear begins to look like faith? When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Aztec capital in 1519, they were stunned by what they found, not just the scale of the city, but the depth of its religion. Towering temples, endless offerings, statues caked in dried blood, and the unmistakable odor of sacrifice thick in the air. To the Spaniards, these were not acts of worship. They were signs of savagery. Horrified, they documented what they saw. They wrote of hearts lifted skyward, of prisoners led calmly to their deaths, of priests whose arms were permanently stained red. They described skull racks, long rows of pierced human skulls displayed like trophies near the temples. For the Europeans, this was evidence not of sacred duty, but of devilish evil. But what the conquerors didn't understand, or refused to, was that these sacrifices had deep meaning. The Aztecs did not offer blood to please cruel gods. They offered it because they believed life itself was a loan, and payment was due. Still, as Spanish cannons roared and disease swept through the valley, the world the Aztecs had built began to collapse. Their gods grew quiet. Their temples were torn down. Christian crosses replaced serpent carvings, and sacrifice, once the heartbeat of the empire, was outlawed, declared a sin, and hunted to extinction. The final sacrifices were not recorded. In glory they were whispered, hidden, perhaps even mourned. Over time, the rituals disappeared, but something of the old ways remained, in small traditions, in beliefs passed down quietly, in the maize still grown with care, and the incense still burned on altars during Dia de los Muertos. The gods may have gone silent, but memory endures in unexpected places. Today, we may see Aztecs sacrifice only through the lens of shock, but to live in that world meant believing deeply in duty, in balance, in giving something precious so that the world would continue turning. Even if it meant blood, there is unease in that idea, and also beauty, because, in a way, the Aztecs understood something we still grapple with, that life demands offering, not always in blood, but in time, in labor, in love, in loss. They gave what they believed was required to hold their world together, and when their world ended, they still watched the sun rise one final time. So, as the fires of their pyramids dim, and the echoes of their drums fade into night, we're left with a question that still stirs, centuries later. What are we willing to give to keep the world turning? In the great capital of Tenochtitlan, with its shimmering canals and bustling markets, justice was never far from sight. It walked among the people, not quietly but boldly, in the form of judges, patrols, and executioners. For the Aztecs, law wasn't just a guideline, it was sacred, and breaking it came at a steep cost. There were no second chances. One wrong move, and you might not live to make another. The Aztec legal system was surprisingly organized for its time. It featured professional judges, detailed legal codes, and even appeals in certain cases. But it was also deeply unforgiving, rooted in the belief that law upheld the divine order. The system made examples of those who stepped out of line, stealing a cloak, cheating on your spouse, disrespecting a superior. Any of these could result in death, and not quietly either. Executions were public, ritualistic, and designed to serve as warnings. The message was simple: Order must be preserved at any cost. There were jails, yes, but they were temporary holding places, not long-term. Solutions. Punishment was swift. You might be stoned to death in the market square, or dragged through the streets for a crowd to see. Thieves could be enslaved for life. Adulterers were strangled. Repeat offenses were rarely tolerated, and the laws applied across all classes in theory. Even nobles could be punished. In fact, the law often demanded harsher penalties for them, not lighter. If a commoner committed a crime, he might pay with servitude. If a noble did the same, the sentence could be execution. Nobility came with privilege and greater expectations. Parents were allowed to report their own children for laziness, drunkenness, or disobedience. If the accusation was confirmed, the punishment was severe: public whipping, shaving the head in disgrace, or even execution in extreme cases. Discipline was not just personal, it was public, structured, and sacred. And yet the system was not chaos. Trials were held before judges. Witnesses were required. False testimony was a crime in itself. Special courts existed for different types of disputes: land, inheritance, trade. Merchants had their own laws. Priests had theirs. And there were even protections for those who could prove ignorance of the law, especially if they were young or from rural areas. Still, punishment was harsh. Why? Because to the Aztecs, crime was not just a disruption of peace. It was a crack in the cosmic balance. Every person, every role, every law held the universe together, and if one piece faltered, the entire order risked collapse. Justice, then, wasn't about mercy, it was about survival. So, as you walk through the busy markets of Tenochtitlan, watching traders haggle, children run barefoot, guards stand silent at corners, you do not forget the rules. You do not test the line. You do not speak out of turn. Because in this empire, even a small offense might be your last. And yet, as the sun sets behind the towering temples, you may wonder if fear is what keeps peace in place. What happens when the fear fades? Justice. In the Aztec Empire was not simply about punishment. It was about preserving cosmic order. Every law upheld a balance between people, gods, and nature. Breaking that balance wasn't just a crime, it was a spiritual threat, which meant that judgment didn't always come from a single authority. It came from many layers of society. At the local level, village elders or market officials handled small disputes. These could range from arguments over land to accusations of fraud or disorder. But in the capital city of Tenochtitlan, justice was centralized. At the top sat the Tlaxcatlan, a supreme court made up of high-ranking judges, trained in ritual law, lineage traditions, and social expectations. These judges didn't wear robes or wigs. They wore feathered cloaks and jade jewelry, symbols of their wisdom and sacred duty. When you stood before them, you were not pleading your case to a man, but to the gods themselves. Some laws might seem strange to modern eyes. Public drunkenness was a serious offense. For adults under a certain age, being caught drunk in public, even once, could mean execution. Why? Because intoxication was seen as a failure of self-control. And in Aztec belief, self-discipline was the foundation of a stable society. Likewise, laziness wasn't just frowned upon, it was a crime. An adult who refused to work or contribute could be reported by family or neighbors. If found guilty, they might be beaten, branded, or forced into slavery. Hard labor was not just economic, it was moral, but not all punishments were final. The Aztec system did allow for second chances. if you were young, inexperienced, or willing to change. There was even a ritual for redemption. If someone confessed their crime at a temple before being caught, they could be forgiven. This wasn't leniency, it was seen as divine cleansing. Once forgiven, though, they had no room for error. A repeat offense would lead to swift and permanent justice. Punishments could also be symbolic. A merchant caught cheating might have his goods destroyed in the public square. A liar might have his lips pierced or burned. These were not just punishments, they were reminders to the community. Justice is watching. Even in small things, some sentences included enslavement, but Aztec slavery was not always lifelong. It could be temporary, based on repayment of debt or punishment. A man might work off his crime in service to a temple or noble family. If he served faithfully, he might be freed, restored with honor. Still, there was little room for rebellion. Those who challenged the system, who incited unrest, spread lies about rulers, or disrespected sacred rituals, were dealt with quickly. Not just to silence them, but to protect the delicate threads that held society together. Because justice wasn't just law, it was ritual, it was memory, it was fear wrapped in the language of order. So, as you imagine walking through the streets of this empire, it's not just the temples or the soldiers that keep people in line. It's the quiet knowledge that someone is always watching, and that mistakes are rarely forgiven twice. And still, a question stirs like wind through the courtrooms. Can justice truly be just? If mercy has no place to stand in the final years of the Aztec Empire, as the Spanish approached from the coast and the winds of change began to stir, the machinery of Aztec justice kept turning, just as it always had. Judges still listened from beneath feathered canopies. Guards still patrolled the markets. The guilty were still punished swiftly, often fatally. But beneath the order, there were signs of strain. The empire was expanding rapidly, stretching its control over distant regions and newly conquered peoples. Maintaining discipline across this growing landscape became harder. In far-off provinces, resentment brewed. People followed the laws, but increasingly out of fear, not faith in those outer regions. Justice became less about truth and more about control. A minor crime might bring a major sentence, not because it was severe, but because it was a symbol. A village resisting tribute might see its leaders imprisoned or executed as a warning to others. A merchant who questioned tax collectors might be accused of disrespecting the gods. The law was still followed, but selectively, strategically. Meanwhile, in the heart of Tenochtitlan, the rituals of law carried on, even as the empire itself teetered on the edge. When Hernan courts arrived in Iwo-Ijo, bringing gifts, interpreters, and unfamiliar ideas, he was met not with chaos, but with order. The Spaniards noted how clean the streets were, how organized the markets, how tightly run the city appeared. What they didn't see or chose not to understand was how much of that order was built on fear. They saw judges and guards, but not the quiet tension behind every law. They saw people kneeling in respect, but not the consequences for standing up. They saw a world held together by ritual and rule, but they mistook obedience for peace. After the fall of the empire, the Aztec legal system was dismantled piece by piece. Spanish law replaced native courts. Public executions and self-sacrifice were outlawed. The complex codes of behavior, once tied to divine order, were rewritten in the name of empire, and later, colonization. But echoes of Aztec justice remained. In community councils, in ritual memory, in the quiet understanding that law shapes belief, and belief shapes how we live. and die today. It's easy to look back and see only the harshness, the stonings, the public beatings, the rigid codes, but that's not the full picture. Aztec justice was harsh, yes, but also deeply structured, communal, and spiritually grounded. In many ways, it demanded accountability from all, even nobles, even priests. It asked people to live, not for themselves, but for the greater order. Still, it leaves us wondering what happens to a society built on strict rules, when those rules are no longer sacred. What happens when fear begins to outweigh faith? And when order is kept only by punishment? What remains when the punishments stop? In the dense neighborhoods of Tenochtitlan, where homes were built close together and life followed the rhythms of gods and kings, there was one thing you could never expect: privacy, not in your home, not in your thoughts, and certainly not in your sleep. The Aztec world was structured by ritual, and those rituals didn't end at sunset. In fact, many began when the city went quiet, after the marketplace closed, after the fires dimmed, after the last prayers of the day were offered. Even night, it seemed, had its responsibilities. Sleep was not merely rest. It was a space where the boundaries between the mortal and spiritual world blurred. Dreams were considered meaningful, even prophetic. Priests studied them. Elders asked about them. A bad dream wasn't ignored. It was interpreted. It might mean an illness was coming, or that the gods were displeased. In some cases, it could even justify punishment or ritual cleansing. And so, before you laid your head down for the night, you followed the rules. No eating heavy food after dark. No sleeping with your feet toward the hearth. It was said to invite spirits. No loud talk. No anger. No unresolved arguments. Children were told to apologize before bed, lest the gods see their disobedience in dreams. The home itself was not private either. Most families lived in 1- or 2-room dwellings. Grandparents, parents, and children all shared the same space. There were no bedrooms, just sleeping mats, unrolled when night fell and folded at dawn. Your every movement was noticed. Your silence was expected. Even lovers, even married couples, had little time alone. Modesty was enforced not by doors, but by discipline. Intimacy was private only in ritual, often shaped by the lunar calendar and monitored by tradition. There were designated times for conception and times to abstain. Everything, even affection, followed the pulse of the gods. For many, night was also a time of service. Guards patrolled the neighborhoods, ensuring no fires went unattended, no strangers crept into courtyards. Some temples held midnight ceremonies. Farmers rose before dawn to prepare for fieldwork, guided by the flickering stars and the hum of cicadas. Sleep was something you earned, not indulged in. And if you tried to escape these rules, if you ignored the signs, disrespected the sacred times, or disturbed your neighbors, there were consequences. The community might shame you, elders might scold you, priests might be called to cleanse your home with incense and chant. In this world, you were never truly alone. The gods watched, the ancestors listened, and the city breathed together, even in dreams. And yet, lying on your woven mat beneath the faint light of a cooking fire, you might still whisper a quiet thought to yourself: if every moment must serve a rule, when do we belong to ourselves? To live as an Aztec was to live within a sacred rhythm, one where time wasn't measured just by the sun, but by ceremony, calendar, and obligation. Even rest, even silence, even the hours spent in darkness were shaped by cosmic patterns. The Tunalpahuli, or sacred calendar, played a powerful role in dictating the unseen rules of daily life. It divided time into 260 days, each assigned a name, number, and patron deity. And on every one of those days, certain acts were favored, while others were forbidden. Some days were good for planting, some for fasting, others for bathing, praying, or even conceiving children. But a great many days were not good for sleep. On unlucky nights, identified by trained priests and marked in katases, people might be advised to sleep facing a certain direction, avoid contact with strangers, or even remain partially awake. These nights were thought to be thin spaces between the earthly and spiritual realms. To sleep carelessly was to invite trouble, and trouble, in the Aztec mind, came not from outside the city walls, but from the unseen world all around. Spirits were everywhere. The dead could walk during certain festivals. Mischievous beings could slip through cracks in ritual. A newborn left alone at night might attract a harmful presence. Even breezes were believed to carry omens. That's why incense was burned at dusk, not just for scent, but to purify the air. Children were especially watched during these hours. Mothers might rub their infants with maize dough or sweep under their sleeping mats to ward off illness. Fathers would whisper protective chants near doorways, ensuring no spirit crossed into the home uninvited. For adults, nighttime rituals included quiet prayers and symbolic gestures. Before bed, many would offer thanks to the gods for surviving the day, not a small thing in a world full of hunger, labor, and danger. Some sprinkled a few grains of maize near the hearth, a gesture of gratitude and continuity. Others simply lay in silence, hoping their dreams would be kind. But dreams were rarely private. If you spoke of a troubling dream, your family might bring it to a dream interpreter, often a priest or elder who had memorized vast systems of symbols and meanings. Dreamed of drowning, a bad omen. Dreamed of fire, possibly a warning. Dreamed of a bird flying backwards, something truly strange. Perhaps divine. Your dreams could shape your fate. They might predict illness, travel, even death. That meant even your sleeping self was accountable. And as with all things in Aztec life, your behavior at night reflected your place in society. A noble who failed to perform proper rituals might be accused of arrogance. A commoner who disrespected sleep customs might be called impure. Even at rest, you had a role to play. So imagine it now. You lie with your family on the cool earth floor, rolled in thin blankets, the fire fading. Your father murmurs a chant. Your mother sprinkles incense. By the doorway, no one speaks. The city is quiet, but not asleep, because even in darkness, the rules are awake. And as your eyes begin to close, you wonder if there is no space that belongs only to me. Then where do I truly live, even in my own dreams, in the final days of the Aztec Empire, as whispers of strange men on horseback drifted into the Valley of Mexico? The people of Tenochtitlan still lit their evening fires, still burned copal incense at twilight, still whispered their prayers before laying down to sleep, even as the world beyond their city began to shift. The inner rituals held strong, but not for long. When the Spanish entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, they brought more than swords and steel. They brought a different idea of silence, one that didn't respect the dreams of others. They brought new gods who didn't demand incense at dusk, new calendars which paid no attention to unlucky nights, and new laws which replaced ritual with rule and replaced fear of spirits with fear of empire. The private rhythms of Aztec nights began to unravel. Temples were burned or torn down. Priests were killed or forced to convert. The sacred calendar, the tonal pahuli, was banned. Families still laid together at night, but the rules had changed. No longer was there one shared way to sleep, dream, or watch the darkness. The quiet discipline that had once shaped every night began to vanish, and yet, not entirely, for generations after the fall of the empire, Aztec families, now Christianized in name, still performed secret gestures before bed. They still hung amulets over cradles, still swept doorways with ritual purpose, still lit candles on certain nights without quite saying why. The sacred rules had been broken, but something of their shape remained in the shadows, because ritual, once learned deeply, doesn't die quickly. Even today, in rural parts of Mexico, bedtime carries small echoes of the old ways. Children are warned not to whistle after dark. Elders tell stories of spirits that wander at night. Offerings are still made on altars. Dreams are still taken seriously, and the longing for quiet, the longing for some shared rhythm that connects the body to the world, remains. We now live in a time that prizes privacy. We close doors, we wear headphones, we scroll late into the night, often alone. Sleep is a personal retreat, not a shared ritual. We forget that, once, sleep was a communal act, shaped by gods, guarded by tradition, and filled with meaning. So, as you lie down tonight, alone or with loved ones, remember this: there was once a city where no one slept without permission, where rest was not escape, but participation, where dreams were not secrets, but messages, and where even silence had a script. The gods may have gone quiet, but the night still listens, and as your eyes begin to close, a final question lingers. In the still air, when we no longer sleep by ritual, what guides our dreams now? In the Aztec world, childhood was not a protected space. It was not a time for carefree play or gentle indulgence. It was a training ground for labor, for loyalty, and for survival. And that training began early as age 3 taught to raise. A child in the city of Tenochtitlan was to prepare them for a life of order and obligation. Even the youngest members of society were seen as bearers of responsibility. The idea wasn't to shield them from hardship, but to introduce them to it slowly, deliberately, and with sacred purpose. At age 3, a child would receive their first tools, not toys. A boy might be given small firewood sticks or practice farming tools. A girl weaving instruments or grinding stones. These weren't gifts, they were signals, markers that the time for work had begun. By age 4, children were expected to help their parents with simple household duties: fetching water, carrying small loads, sweeping floors. Not perfectly, of course, but obediently. Laziness was not just frowned upon, it was corrected, gently at first. Then firmly, discipline was central. Aztec parenting was not cruel for cruelty's sake, but it was strict, built on a foundation of fear, respect, and religious duty. Children were taught to be silent in the presence of elders, to rise early, and to perform chores without complaint. If a child cried or misbehaved, parents might lightly prick their skin with maguey thorns, a symbolic punishment meant to teach obedience through pain, and if bad behavior continued, the consequences escalated. By age 7, children who disrespected authority might be tied and briefly left outside, exposed to the cold or stung by insects, all under the watchful eye of the family. These punishments were meant to shape, not to injure. The lesson was always the same. Obedience is sacred. Without it, a child would grow into a danger to the family, to the gods, and to society. But this discipline wasn't just parental whim. It was backed by state ideology and religious tradition. Aztec codices, the painted books that recorded social customs, showed images of children being punished for laziness, disrespect, or disobedience. These weren't warnings, they were instructions, proof that raising children well was not a private matter. It was a civic and spiritual duty, and at the heart of it all was a single belief. Children were not born innocent. They were born with energy that had to be shaped, and shaping required pressure. Steady, constant, purposeful. Yet this world wasn't devoid of affection. Parents loved their children deeply. Mothers sang to their babies. Fathers carried their sons on their backs. But love, in Aztec life, was always intertwined with expectation. To love a child meant to mold them, to give them tools, teach them their role, and prepare them to serve the gods, the emperor, and the community. So as you imagine life as an Aztec child, you must imagine a world without softness, a world where your earliest memories are of rules, tasks, and sacred fears. And as the night falls and you lie quietly on a reed mat beside your family, you might wonder if childhood is for duty. When, if ever, does it belong to joy? By the time an Aztec child reached the age of 10, their path in life was already being shaped, not by choice, but by class, gender, and expectation. Boys and girls were trained differently, but neither had an easy road ahead. Childhood, as we understand it today, didn't exist in their world. There was no concept of adolescence as a time of exploration or identity. There was only the path you were born to follow. For boys, life became a preparation for war, labor, or ritual service. From an early age, they were taught to endure pain, to obey without hesitation, and to suppress weakness. Whining was met with punishment. So was laziness. Even playing too much was frowned upon, a sign that the child did not yet understand the seriousness of life. At 15, boys were sent to school, and schooling, too, was determined by status. Sons of nobles attended the Comicac, where they studied religion, astronomy, and military leadership. Sons of commoners attended the Telpochcali, where training focused on physical endurance, weapons handling, farming, and communal labor. Discipline. In these schools was extreme. Boys who misbehaved might be forced to sleep outside on cold stone floors. They might be made to sweep temple steps from dawn till dusk. In some cases, they were pricked with thorns or held over burning chilly smoke, not to injure them permanently, but to purify them through suffering. Why so much pain? Because, in Aztec belief, discipline created virtue. The gods had sacrificed themselves to keep the world alive, and so the people, especially young men, were expected to learn sacrifice from a young age. Discipline wasn't cruelty, it was preparation. For war, for duty, for death, if necessary. For girls, the path was different, but no less demanding. From early childhood, girls were expected to help with domestic tasks, grinding maize, weaving cloth, tending the fire. By the time they were 7 or 8, they were skilled in the household arts. Weaving was considered a sacred act, a spiritual duty tied to the goddess Chentico, protector of the home. Girls, too, were sent to school, though far fewer than boys. Some noble daughters attended special religious schools, where they were trained to become priestesses or midwives. but most were educated at home. Their learning centered on obedience, cleanliness, and family honor. They were taught modesty in dress and speech, taught to walk with eyes lowered, taught to serve, support, and eventually marry, not for love, but for stability. Marriages were arranged by elders, based on family alliances and social rank, and girls could be married as young as 15. Any display of pride, disrespect, or laziness was punished swiftly. A misbehaving daughter might be shamed publicly, her hair cut short, or her body pierced with thorns, not as vengeance, but as a reminder that even women carried the weight of cultural survival in this world. There was no phase of life where one simply grew up. You were always becoming and always being watched. So whether you were a boy shouldering a wooden log in temple school or a girl quietly weaving beside your mother, one thing was certain: you did not belong to yourself. And yet, as dusk settled across the city and the fires dimmed, a question may have flickered quietly behind young eyes. If obedience is everything, what becomes of the self left behind? When the Spanish conquistadors entered the Aztec world, they brought more than weapons and disease. They brought new ideas of childhood, softer ideas, ideas where children were to be protected, taught gently, and loved without condition. To them, the Aztec way seemed cold. They saw small children being punished harshly. They saw teenage boys carrying loads for temple guards. They saw girls grinding maize before sunrise. To Spanish eyes, it was too much, too soon. But to the Aztecs, it was necessary, because life was hard and it was short. The average Aztec did not live past their mid-30s. Death from war, childbirth, famine, or disease was common. A child who was not strong, obedient, and useful by their teen years might not survive at all. Neither would their family, and so, for all its strictness, Aztec discipline was not born from hatred or cruelty. It came from urgency. It came from a sense of cosmic duty. And it came from a belief that every person, even a small child, had a role to play in keeping the universe in balance. But when the empire fell, so did its institutions of discipline. The temple schools were shut down. The gods that had watched over children's rites of passage were declared false. Spanish missionaries set up new schools, ones that taught reading, prayer, and submission to Christian beliefs. The thorn-piercing punishments were banned. Parental discipline was redefined, and yet, even centuries later, traces of the old system lingered. Elders in rural villages still told children not to be lazy, that the gods watched those who wasted the day. Parents still passed down stories of suffering bringing strength. The expectation of obedience remained, even as the rituals changed shape in modern times. Scholars look back on Aztec child rearing with both awe and discomfort. Awe at its structure, at its clarity, at its ability to prepare children for real hardships, and discomfort at its severity, at the fear it instilled, at the absence of play, because there was play, but it was never just for fun. It was exercise. It was training. It was preparation. Even laughter had boundaries. So what do we make of this world? A world where a child's worth was measured not in imagination, but in discipline. Perhaps we see in it a reflection of what all societies struggle with. How do we raise children to survive the world without breaking the spirit that makes them human? The Aztecs chose one path, one of structure, obedience, and sacred pressure. And while their empire is long gone, the questions they wrestled with still whisper to us across time. When does teaching become shaping? When does shaping become control? And what is lost? when a child is never allowed to simply be. In the heart of the Aztec Empire, language was not just a way to speak, it was a way to belong and to survive. The empire stretched wide, encompassing dozens of different ethnic groups and languages, Mixtec, Otomi, Maya, and more. But at its core, in the palaces of Tenochtitlan, in the markets, the courts, and the temples, only one language truly mattered: Nahuatl. If you didn't speak Nahuatl, you were already an outsider. To speak Nahuatl was to participate in power. It was the language of the priests, the merchants, the government scribes. It was the medium through which laws were passed, taxes collected, marriages arranged, and justice delivered. In the bustling markets, traders shouted their goods in Nahuatl. In courtrooms, your defense had to be spoken in Nahuatl. In rituals, prayers to the gods were recited in precise Nahuatl phrases. Errors could offend the divine. Children were raised to speak it fluently from their earliest years. Mothers sang lullabies in Nahuatl. Fathers gave instructions, corrected mispronunciations, told ancestral stories, all in the same melodic, poetic tongue. Words were not only for meaning, they carried rhythm and ceremony. Even insults had rules. Eloquence was admired. Silence was suspect. By the age of 3 or 4, children were already learning formal speech. By 10, they were expected to speak with precision and respect, using the correct forms to address elders, officials, and gods. Those who failed to learn were considered lazy or worse, impure. For those born outside the Central Valley, the conquered peoples, learning Nahuatl was both a burden and a lifeline. Without it, they could not move up the social ladder. They could not work in government or serve in temples. They could not marry into noble families or speak before judges, so the language of empire became a gatekeeper. It excluded those who didn't speak it, and it elevated those who mastered it. Some communities resisted preserving their own languages in quiet ways, through whispered songs and secret ceremonies, but public life belonged to Nahuatl. The Aztecs had no official ban on other tongues, but there was no need for one. The system made it clear: if you could not be understood, you did not matter. Even among the elite, speech was a test. Nobles were trained in oratory, how to speak in metaphors, how to praise the gods, how to speak without stuttering, how to answer riddles. Words were sharpened tools. One misspoken phrase in front of the emperor could bring shame to an entire lineage. Language was not just survival, it was identity. And identity, in the Aztec world, was everything. So, imagine yourself now, a newcomer in Tenochtitlan. The city roars with voices, Nahuatl flowing from every corner. You try to ask a question in your native tongue, but no one answers. You offer trade, they don't trust you. You seek a temple, they wave you away. And slowly, you understand, if you cannot speak the empire's language, you do not exist within it. And so a quiet question forms in your mind: if the tongue is the key to belonging, what happens to those whose voices were never heard? In the Aztec world, to master Nahuatl was to unlock access to more than just communication. It meant access to education, religion, justice, and survival. The empire didn't operate through written laws on paper. It ran on spoken tradition, ritual phrasing, and an intricate system of honorifics and formality. Words carried not only meaning, but social weight. How you spoke mattered just as much as what you said, and that meant that the untrained ear, the outsider, was always at risk. You could misunderstand an instruction and offend a priest. You could answer a question incorrectly in court and lose your land. You could fail to use the proper titles for a noble or elder and find yourself accused of disrespect. A crime in many contexts. Nahuatl wasn't just the language of daily life, it was the language of sacred power. Rituals were conducted entirely in Nahuatl. Complex prayers, mythic chants, and invocations were memorized by students and priests from an early age. Each phrase had to be perfectly recited, or the gods might be displeased. A slight stumble in tone or rhythm could be interpreted as bad luck, spiritual impurity, or even a sign of divine punishment to come. In Aztec schools, whether the Telpoch for commoners or the Comacac for noble children, Nahuatl literacy was central. Students learned to compose speeches, record tribute lists, and chant ancient hymns. Some learned the pictographic script, which wasn't a true alphabet but a system of symbols and signs, designed to accompany oral recitation. But even when reading images, you still had to speak Nahuatl to give them life. Scribes, the elite record keepers of the empire, were revered not just for their knowledge of writing, but for their ability to speak clearly, formally, and flawlessly. The most skilled could deliver ceremonial announcements or negotiate tribute with faraway provinces. Their voices carried the authority of the empire, but not everyone had access to these tools. Conquered peoples, especially those in the periphery of the empire, often struggled. Their children weren't always sent to Aztec schools. Their communities lacked formal scribes. Some tried to pass on Nahuatl through trade or contact. Others resisted, preserving their own tongues and cultures in private, but the risk was always there. Without Nahuatl, you were vulnerable, easily cheated in the market, left out of decisions, unrepresented in court. Even among those who spoke Nahuatl, accents and dialects could betray your origins. A rural accent might mark you as a peasant. A misused idiom might reveal you were from a border province. In a society obsessed with rank and ritual, these small slips had real consequences. So people learned to hide their roots. They trained their voices, mimicked city speakers, practiced formal phrases by firelight. For many, learning Nahuatl fluently wasn't just about pride, it was survival strategy, a way to move through the empire unnoticed, unharmed, and perhaps, one day, respected. But in doing so, many gave up parts of themselves, their native songs, their ancestral stories, their village speech. These were not forgotten overnight, but over generations they faded. And so, across the wide empire, countless voices grew quiet, not by force, but by slow exclusion, which leaves us wondering, when the price of survival is silence, what parts of ourselves are we forced to leave behind? When the Spanish conquest began in 1519, it was not just a war of weapons, it was a war of words. The Spaniards brought translators, like the famous Malinche, known to history as La Malinche, who could speak Nahuatl fluently. They knew that language was the key to understanding, negotiating, and eventually controlling the Aztec world. And so, one of the first things they did was learn the tongue of empire. But ironically, as they conquered, they also undermined the very language they relied on. Once the Aztec Empire fell, Nahuatl was no longer the voice of the powerful. The Spanish began to impose their own language, Castilian, and with it, a new hierarchy. Nahuatl, once the sign of culture, education, and divine order, slowly became a mark of the conquered. Still, it didn't vanish overnight. Nahuatl was so widespread, so deeply rooted, that Spanish missionaries learned it to preach. Colonial officials used it for communication. Many early Christian texts were even translated into Nahuatl to ease conversion. For a time, the language held on, a proud echo of the past, spoken in streets, homes, and prayer halls. But over the centuries, things changed. Spanish-language schools replaced Aztec ones. Indigenous children were forbidden from speaking Nahuatl. In public spaces, courtrooms, once full of precise ceremonial Nahuatl speech, now demanded Spanish. Slowly, fluency declined. Traditions tied to language, the poetry, the riddles, the ceremonial announcements faded from memory. By the 18th century, Nahuatl had gone from imperial voice to colonial whisper, and yet it never died. Even today, Nahuatl is still spoken by over 1 million people across Mexico. In rural villages, elders teach it to grandchildren. Traditional healers use it in ritual. Activists use it in schools. Artists write poetry in it. And historians patiently, reverently, piece together its ancient meanings from codices, stone inscriptions, and oral tradition, because, in Nahuatl, there are things you cannot say the same way in any other language. There are metaphors that carry cosmic weight, and words that reflect a world built on balance, sacrifice, and reciprocity. There is a phrase in Tilapali, meaning the black and the red, symbolizing both ink and wisdom. In Nahuatl, even color holds memory. Language, after all, is more than vocabulary. It is the way a people think, remember, and relate to the world. The story of Nahuatl is the story of cultural survival. Not always loud, not always visible, but persistent. It reminds us that even when empires fall and rulers are forgotten, words can outlast them all. So, as we reflect on this world, where language meant inclusion and exclusion and survival, we ask, what happens when a language is silenced? Not by force, but by forgetfulness. And more quietly still, if language is how a people remember, then what part of the Aztecs still lives, every time a Nahuatl word is whispered beneath the stars? In the Aztec world, your fate wasn't a mystery. It was charted before your first breath, marked in the heavens, written in the turning of sacred calendars. From the moment an Aztec child was born, the day and hour of their arrival were carefully recorded, not for celebration, but for interpretation. Because in this empire of stone and sun, it wasn't just who you were that mattered. It was when the Aztecs believed that the universe operated on powerful cycles of time. These cycles were tracked through to complex calendars, the Tinal, a 260-day ritual calendar, and the Shupowali, a 365-day solar calendar. The intersection of these two cycles created repeating combinations that shaped destiny. Each day in the ritual calendar was ruled by a specific deity and associated with an animal, an element, and certain qualities. A person born on one Mazatl one deer might be seen as brave but reckless. Someone born on Forosolotl for jaguar might be destined for leadership or early death in war. And so, shortly after birth, a Tanalpauk, a diviner trained in calendrical wisdom, was called to consult the charts. Using sacred books made of bark paper, inked with pictograms and symbols, they would examine the newborn's date and declare their fate. Some were born under lucky signs, others under difficult ones, and some under days so feared that parents might seek spiritual cleansing for the child at once. These readings weren't taken lightly. The diviner's verdict could shape the child's future, what kind of education they received, what profession they would be steered toward, even whether they were encouraged to marry or remain celibate in temple service. A child marked for greatness might be sent to the Comicac, a school for nobles, priests, and future leaders. Another, born under poor omens, might be trained for a short, honorable life as a warrior, expected to die young in sacrifice or combat. But fate wasn't always accepted blindly. If a birth fell on an especially unlucky day, one ruled by a vengeful or chaotic deity, parents might delay the naming ceremony. They might wait for a more favorable date to offer the child to the gods, in hopes of softening the star's judgment. Some even performed small rituals with herbs, smoke, or bloodletting to balance the child's cosmic alignment. Still, in most cases, the stars were final dot. To the Aztecs, destiny was like a road, narrow, winding, difficult, but laid down long before the traveler set foot upon it. You could walk carefully, stumble, or fall, but the path itself was set by heavenly design. In this world, choice was limited, but meaning was everywhere. Every success, every failure, every illness or stroke of luck, it could all be traced back to the alignment of the stars on the day of your birth. And as the fire burned low in your family's home, you might lie, awake, wondering, was it really me who failed? Or was I simply walking the path written in the sky? In the Aztec world, the sky was not just beautiful, it was alive. A vast, breathing map of divine forces. The stars were not distant points of light but symbols of power, prophecy, and responsibility. To understand a person's fate, it wasn't enough to look at the day of their birth. You had to understand the whole cosmic structure around it. At the center of this system was the Tonal Puthuli, the 260-day ritual calendar, composed of 20 named days and 13 numbers that cycled endlessly. This created 260 unique combinations, each associated with specific deities, elements, and character traits. The calendar wasn't used for seasons or farming. It was used for spiritual timing, naming ceremonies, marriages, travel, war, and even executions. Imagine it, before an Aztec went to war. They might consult a priest to determine whether the day's sign favored victory or death. A farmer might delay planting if the day was governed by a bad omen. A merchant would wait to open a trade deal until the stars suggested harmony. But perhaps the most intimate use of this calendar was in guiding personal identity. If you were born on 3 Cuscacutli, 3 Vulture, it meant you were likely to face a hard life, but might find honor in sacrifice. Born on 7 Nahuatl, 7 Water, and you were expected to be emotional, poetic, and spiritually sensitive. Every name held a mirror to the soul, not always comforting, but always present, and these signs weren't private. Everyone in your family, your community, even your school, knew your birth sign. It shaped how they saw you. Sometimes, it shaped how you saw yourself. Some were told from childhood that they had been born under signs of destruction or laziness. Others were praised early as promising leaders or future priests. And though the Aztecs believed in balance, that the gods could be pleased, that fate could be softened, the weight of cosmic identity was always there. The sky didn't forget. This cosmic system extended beyond birth. Marriages were also arranged based on calendrical compatibility. The family priest would compare the birth signs of 2 people. If the pairing was harmonious, the union was approved. If not, even love might not be enough to overcome the warning. To marry under the wrong alignment was to risk sickness, quarrels, or even early death. Even death had its place in the stars. People who died on certain days were believed to go to specific afterlives. Warriors slain in battle or sacrifices climbed the sun's path. Those who drowned went to the water god's realm. Others faced the long, cold journey to Mictlan, the land of the dead, where 4 years of trials awaited before peace could be reached. Every moment, from the first breath to the last, was embedded in the cosmic schedule. There were no accidents, only divine timing. So, as you walk through the bustling streets of Tenochtitlan, every face you pass is a walking calendar. Every name carries a meaning shaped by the sky. And as night falls and you look upward, you see more than stars. You see your future, and a question rises with the stars. If everything is written above, can we ever truly write anything below? When the Spanish arrived in the Valley of Mexico, they brought with them a very different sky. In their world, stars were distant lights. The heavens were ruled by a single god, not cycles of energy and fate. The calendars of Europe counted days in a line, not in loops. And the idea that your destiny was fixed at birth by divine timing, that was seen as dangerous, superstitious, something to be rooted out. And so, after the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec astrologers, the Tenalpauc, were silenced. Their sacred books were burned, their charts confiscated, their temples were pulled down stone by stone. But the people remembered, even as they learned the names of Christian saints. Many still whispered the signs of the Tonal-Pahuli. Parents still counted the days after birth, quietly noting what combination of gods had arrived with the child. Farmers still looked to the moon and stars, wondering whether the new calendar truly understood their land. Over time, Aztec astrology went underground. Its symbols lived on in folk traditions, in bedtime stories, in secret notebooks kept by families who remembered. The names of days might be changed, but their spirit remained. A child born under a bad sign might still be watched more closely. A marriage might still be delayed until the stars felt right. Centuries passed, the empire faded into history. But the pull of the stars never fully vanished in modern day. Mexico, Nahuatl-speaking communities still trace parts of the Tonal-Pahuli in their oral histories. Some healers, known as curanderos, blend Catholic prayer with ancient calendrical wisdom. And in urban centers, artists and scholars have begun to revive the symbols once used to mark cosmic identity. Even today, there are people who know what day they were born on, not just on the Gregorian calendar, but on the Aztec one. People who still believe that the stars don't just shine, they speak. And that belief, though quiet now, still raises profound questions. The Aztecs understood time not as a line, but as a circle, one that turns again and again, pulling us back to where we've already been. In their eyes, history repeats, fate echoes, and the sky remembers. So as we lie down tonight under the same stars, we might ask, what if the universe is speaking to us, just not in a language we've remembered how to hear? What if fate isn't fixed, but shaped by the ritual of paying attention? What if, long ago, someone looked into the heavens on the day you were born, and whispered your name alongside the gods into the dark? And what does it mean to live in a world where your very birth was an answer to a question the stars had already asked? And now, our quiet journey comes to a close. Thank you for being here, for walking these ancient paths with me, through temples, markets, and sacred hillsides of a world long gone. Why you wouldn't last a day in the Aztec Empire, not because you're weak, but because their world was carved in stone, blood, and silence. Every moment a ritual, every breath a duty, and yet, there was beauty, too. In the order, the stars, the steady rhythm of life beneath the sun. We've drifted far tonight. From soft pillows to obsidian blades, from warm blankets to moonlit altars. And now, perhaps, your eyes grow heavy, your thoughts like shadows begin to blur and soften. Wherever you are now, may your night be just as still as theirs once was. May peace settle around you, like snow on an untouched field, or the final flicker of a candle in a quiet room. If this gentle wander through history brought you comfort, you're welcome to subscribe, but only if it feels right in this soft, quiet moment. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and let the past keep watch as you rest.